Hello and welcome to Bardosh Expounded Round 1. Here's why I like Bardosh, and I hope that you can find him useful to some degree. The policy process is a confusing one. It's full of data and information and competing discourses and competing stories about what is and what needs to be changed. Students often look at all of that swirl of information and chaos and panic and think, how will I ever organize this into one particular perspective or one particular way of looking at it, or how will I even take a stand to advocate for a very particular change in one direction? That's very difficult. It's a little bit like rowing a boat out into the middle of a very foggy pond and having to believe that there is another side to that pond. Bardosh, in a way, helps you organize your thinking and helps you organize the policy processes that we all must participate in and ultimately master when we are becoming social policy advocates. I like the way that he lays out the research process, for example, how to help you get started, how to locate relevant sources, and how to gain access to those sources that you might need to talk to. While much of this comes from just plain experience, there is a lot that you can learn from reading him and from figuring out how to apply some of the things that he talks about. By now, I think you probably all have located some relevant sources, both from the internet, from the library, and from our community. Now maybe it's time to talk a little bit about conducting a policy research interview. How is that different from a regular counseling interview or a motivational interview or from an ethnographic interview? It certainly is, and it's probably a good idea to think about that together. The first thing that you're going to want to do is decide if your conversations and your interviews are more than a casual conversation, and if you are collecting data that you will then use in a very particular way. It's a good idea to take a look at the HSIRB website for the University of Montana. All research has to pass a human subjects review board. And so you'll want to potentially fill out an IRB for your interviews. You can take a look at that site and determine whether or not you'll need that. I think most of the time you will. And you can also call the Human Subjects Institutional Review Board office and talk with them about what you want to do and whether or not you need one. They are very easy to fill out. It takes a very short amount of time, and I'm always available to help you. And so that's a really good idea to get that going fairly quickly. So what is a policy interview like? In some respects, it is like an ethnographic interview. You want someone to tell you how they think about an issue, how it impacts them, and why they've come to hold the perspective that they do. So your interview is going to be to ask questions that help someone tell about the experiences that they've had. A lot of time with policy advocacy from social work's perspective, we deal still in human pain. And so the story is not going to be an easy one. And your task will be to help someone tell about the experiences that they've had and perhaps even share with you their vision of what needs to change. Most people who are suffering and in pain have a pretty clear idea, not only that they want the pain to stop, but how the pain should stop. And so you will want to ask questions that can elicit that story. It's okay to touch on some real emotion in these interviews, and you should anticipate that. And the way that we handle that is to elicit it and to affirm it and to hear it and to understand that it excuse me, may be part of the story. So I think the other thing to think about is that there really is no one truth in our policy interviews. We are going to be hearing a compilation of stories, and we'll put that together to try and make a whole. So who do you interview? My own thinking is this. You need to talk to people who can provide you with information and help you see all sides of a complicated issue. People who are proponents as well as opponents, people who may share your passion and perspective, and people who have a very different perspective than you. This also comes from Bardosh. When we sit down to do the interview, there are some ways of conducting an interview from a political policy standpoint that might be different from other types. For one, a lot of social science research is embedded in neutrality. We want to collect data as neutrally as we possibly can. I think that through the policy process, often neutrality is not something that we're going to seek, and I think it would be a mistake to convey yourself as a neutral person or removed in some way from the passionate and emotional side or the slant side of an issue. You do have a perspective, and I think it's fine to share that perspective, and I certainly would never pretend to be anything other than you really are or that you really believe. If you have a concern for a particular issue, I think it's a good idea to articulate that concern. If it's early in your policy process and you're still learning about which side of an issue you feel strongly about, I think that's fine to communicate too, as long as you simply represent your perspective. I think that's really important too when you're interviewing someone who is potentially a political opponent, to be very clear that your stance is X and you really want to learn about why, because you don't know about it and you really want to hear that perspective and see if there's a way in which Y can be included in X, if that's what your thinking is, or to simply see how different X and Y really are. Sometimes hearing people's pain or thoughts or convictions will sway your own opinion. Sometimes you'll hear things you never deemed possible, and it will impact your conclusions about how change should happen. And sometimes you'll hear a discourse that you do not agree with, but you know must somehow be accommodated in your overall findings. Your goal in all of this is to weave these perspectives into your thinking and into your analysis of how a problem should be addressed and what needs to change. Finally, a word about confidentiality. Please talk with your sources directly about what kind of confidentiality they need and what you can offer. If you can keep their comments anonymous, then by all means do. You can do this by saying in your report, quote, "We spoke to 20 mothers who play softball, and all of them save one preferred tied." If you cannot or do not want to keep their comments confidential, please let them know that too. For example, in your report you can write, "While all mothers preferred tied, Senator Distelfink remains a strident opponent of any clothes laundering, likening it, in both public speeches and an interview, to the topic of money laundering." I leave you with one final thought. In my experience, people want to tell their stories, and they want to have their stories heard, and they want to know that their life experiences, for better or worse, are going to matter. So one of the things that you'll be doing is to be a conduit for people's voices into the policy arena. It's not a smooth journey. It's not one without its setbacks and scariness, but it is a really important one. Keep up the good work.